white to move here because black just captured the knight on c3. So naturally, white will want to capture back. And then a series of trades happen. Now, the question here is, how does white make this knight better than black's bishop? And black, Magnus Carlsen, at the same time, is going to try and make his bishop extremely good. And you can see some different competing ideas here, which is pretty cool. Both sides go for their own plans, and we get to see which plan proves to be the stronger one. Now, here, Magnus Carlsen plays f6. And the reason for this is to open up the game, because the bishops do really, really good in open positions. And the other reason is that Magnus wants to cause this trade to happen so that a bishop can move out to c7 and look at this diagonal and look at these weak dark squares around the white king. So that is Magnus Carlsen's plan, is to try and have some kind of attack over there, because there's also possible sacrifices of rook takes on f3, which would be really exciting. So this is Magnus's plan. Now, Wesley So, he has his own plan, and he has noticed that by playing f6, Magnus Carlsen has weakened these squares on f7 and on e6. And as you can see, the dark squared bishop cannot fight for control over those squares. So like a white knight on f7 or e6 would be incredibly powerful. So, or a knight on f5. So how does Wesley make this happen? Well, he pushes the pawn out to c4. It's a small move, but a very, very powerful move. Alrighty, so this pawn, what is Wesley doing? Well, Wesley is trying to give black an isolated pawn on d5, which would be really good. And then Wesley is also saying that if Magnus were to take here on c4, then the white could take back with check, and that would give white some more control over these light squares. So that's all that white is trying to do, is trying to go after these weakened light squares that Magnus Carlsen weakened by playing f6. And so that brings up an interesting point. Oftentimes in chess, when you try to carry out your plan, you sometimes can create some weaknesses in your position. And that's what we see here. Okay, so bishop out to c7. Now, why doesn't Magnus simply take here on e5? Well, because it doesn't give him this diagonal. And because the white knight on e5 is incredibly powerful. And yeah, the bishop could potentially head back and attack the knight, but for the moment, the knight is extremely good. And so Magnus doesn't want to make it that easy for Wesley So to get a good outpost for his knight. Wesley takes on d5. Queen takes. E takes f6. Now, why does Magnus take back with the g-pawn? Because it looks really bad. I mean, look at these pawns. They're now split pawns, and they are a whole lot weaker. Not to mention the knight can now get out to f5, and there are no pawns that can challenge that knight on f5. It will be completely dominating the position. So why would Magnus allow this? Well, if he takes on f6, did you see Wesley So's idea? His idea is to play e4, the queen moves, e5, gaining space and shutting down the b8 to h2 diagonal, and then play queen check, which, no matter how black responds, white is simply picking up a pawn on b7. So that's the reason. G takes f6 is played. Now here the important difference is that if white does indeed play check, and the king moves, and then we have queen takes b7, there is this bishop h2 check, and then the queen wins the white queen on b7. So, to illustrate that, check, and oh no, white drops the queen. So white does not want to do that. And that is the difference here. Because in the previous position, when the rook was on f6, let's back up to that. When the rook was on f6, white could gain a tempo with e5, driving the rook back, and then queen b3 picks up the pawn because there is no bishop h2 check now. But after Magnus takes back with g6, after he takes back with the g7 pawn on f6, then white does not have e5 gaining a tempo on a piece, and instead white goes for solidifying his position and making his knight on f5 extremely good. So here we have a strong knight versus a weak bishop. And you can see that even though this bishop has great scope, it does not have any actual targets. And it is tough for black to get the queen over here on d6, because the knight is guarding that. So the bishop would have to move, and then the queen can move over to c7 in order to try to get into h2, but then simply g3, and the knight defends g3, and black cannot make progress. So the white knight is completely dominating that bishop. So here we have c5, d5, keeping the center intact. And as you can see here, not a single white pawn is on the same color as the bishop. So the bishop literally has no targets. Now this is interesting, because way back over here, we can see all of these pawns on the same color as the bishop. All of them potential targets. But Wesley So took these pawns and either traded them off or moved them to a different square, and thus we get this position where not a single pawn can come under attack of that bishop. And that is pretty cool. So the game continues. And Wesley So is probing here for some way in, for some weakness to attack. And Magnus Carlsen does not want white to gradually improve his position. So Magnus takes action before white has a chance to slowly win. So Magnus just doesn't want to slowly lose. He goes in for this sacrifice in order to try and dissolve white's attack. But then, well, Magnus makes a mistake and plays rook takes on d5. Before this moment, white is better here, maybe about the pawn up, and probably would go on to win. But Magnus plays rook takes d5, and this was a blitz game. Wesley takes advantage of that and plays rook out to g4, which simply restricts the black king. So now, if the rook were to retreat, then queen out to f7 would threaten checkmate here, and white, well, will win pretty easily, because black would have to play like queen g5 to stop the checkmate. And you don't want to do that, and anything like rook d7, well, then there's this checkmate. So, therefore, h5 was tried. But then rook check. So you can see that black's rook has left the back rank, and now white is able to get in. Check. And now queen d1, amazing move. Because if white does not defend the back rank, then black has queen f1 threats. And here, white is now threatening, on the next move, to play queen h6, followed by a checkmate. And there's no way for black to stop that threat without losing a serious amount of material. So therefore black resigned. Well, thank you all for watching.